Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We will be listening to 26 cold cases finally solved in 2022.
41-year-old New York-based freelance photographer Linda Lanson was a mother to a girl who was 7 years old. She had relocated to Tampa, Florida to live with her niece Linda Sheffield after leaving New York. Linda Lanson was a really kind woman. She taught Sheffield several fundamental skills that she was unaware of, including how to count, how to do her makeup, and a variety of other things. Nobody knew things were to change forever when Lanson left her residence on the evening of July 10th, 1983. She would never return. Her body was discovered on July 11th, 1983, by a jogger. The body was reported to the Tampa Police Department by him. When police arrived, they discovered the victim in the bushes of a dead-end road, only half dressed, with a gunshot wound to the head. After starting their investigation, the police located her abandoned car the following day on a quiet street about 10 miles from where she was discovered. Shortly after, her purse was discovered in Clearwater, Florida, a city located about 20 miles outside of Tampa by the side of a road. Although the police kept working on this case, they were unable to find any leads until another case very much like it was reported to them a month later. Barbara Grams, then 19 years old, was on her way home from her job at the mall in August 1983 when she never arrived. The neighborhood residents found her body on August 19th, 1983. She'd been abandoned in a Tampa Heights neighborhood behind a dentist's office. Robert Dubois was the initial suspect in the Barbara case. He was 18 years old at the time of the murder, and a local who saw him causing trouble in the community reported him to the police. Robert was questioned by the police, and he agreed to them taking a dental impression to match a bite mark that had been discovered on Barbara's cheek. Dr. Richard Souveron, a forensic odontologist, concluded that the two bite marks matched, and Robert was charged with and found guilty of killing Barbara. Initially given the death penalty, Robert's sentence was changed to life in prison with an extra 15 years in 1988. In order to challenge his conviction, Robert contacted the Innocence Project and denied any role in the murder. In 2020, the Innocence Project team used DNA found from Barbara's body at the time to compare Robert's DNA, and in a shocking turn of events, it didn't match. After serving 37 years in jail for the murder of Barbara, Robert was found to have been falsely imprisoned and was later exonerated. It was then discovered that beeswax, which was not a suitable material for dental molds, was used to create the mold that was obtained from Robert's teeth. Earlier, Dr. Richard claimed that the suspect would have a missing front tooth or a gap between his teeth, two characteristics that Robert didn't have. Even worse, a different dentist later looked at Barbara's wound through some available photos and found that it wasn't even a bite mark at all. The district attorney of Hillsborough County launched an investigation to find out who was to blame for Barbara's demise. The Conviction Review Unit, CRU, was launched by the 13th Judicial Circuit in order to review similar types of cases which needed to be reviewed again, such as cases which were wrongfully convicted by the jurisdiction. The Conviction Review Unit and the Innocence Project were able to perform DNA testing on this case, widely with the help of the local Tampa Police Department and local Innocence Project of Florida. After some detailed DNA testing on some websites in 2022, the Conviction Review Unit and Innocence Project gave important information to the district attorney, which changed the case completely. They discovered that two individuals, not one, were responsible for Barbara's murder, as well as a number of other crimes committed in the Tampa area throughout the 1980s. Amos Robinson, 58, and Abron Scott, 57, were discovered to be guilty not only just for the killing of Barbara Grams, but also for the 39-year-old cold case of Linda Lanson, which occurred just 1 month before Barbara's case. DNA matches established this information. Both were already serving life terms for the murders of Herminia Castro and Carlos Oriana, which occurred within months of the murders of Linda and Barbara. Both of the men were involved in Herminia and Carlos's case, just like they were in Barbara and Linda's case. Robinson has murdered two other convicts and is currently serving 3 life sentences for first and second degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Scott is currently serving a life sentence in prison for first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and burglary. On July 17, 2007, at about 1:20 a.m., there was a disturbing 911 call that went through to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. On the call, a landlord reported a fatal altercation that had taken place between him and a tenant. The deputies from the sheriff's office set off immediately for the scene of the crime. When they arrived at Nature's Trail Mobile Home Park, they came upon a horrific crime scene. The park was located off Morse Bridge Road at Fonotasassa in Hillsborough County, Florida. The landlord who had made the call was Jonathan Burns, a 43-year-old man who co-owned the park, while also living within it. He told the deputies the same story he told the operator on the 911 call, of how he got into a fight with a female tenant and that he killed her in self-defense. He claimed that it was his tenant who attacked him first, and he showed the deputies 2 stab wounds to his abdomen as proof of this claim. He then led the deputies to the scene of the crime, which was outside the trailer of the tenant, Tonya Ann Ottman. There they found her lifeless body, lying on her back and covered in blood. She had 4 stab wounds to her chest and a large laceration across her neck. Deputies found a blood trail in the same area near a dumpster, only about 29 feet away from the dead body. When they followed the blood trail, they found that it ended inside Burns's trailer. When they searched his trailer, they also found the murder weapon, a knife still covered with the blood of the victim. While Tonya's body was taken to the medical examiners for an autopsy, Burns went to the hospital to have his wounds treated. At the Tampa General Hospital, the doctors who treated Burns told him that the knife wounds to his abdomen would require surgery. They also found that other than the knife wounds, his arms were covered with scratches similar to those that would have been found if someone was defending themselves from an attacker. Tonya's autopsy did not give the detectives much new evidence to work with, except for confirming that the cause of death was, in fact, the stab wounds to her chest, as these had pierced her lungs and her heart. From what Burns had told the detectives, it would seem like this case was an open and shut case of self-defense. However, some of the details he gave detectives did not match the evidence they found. This raised doubts in their minds as to whether or not he was actually telling the truth. When they tested the blood on the murder weapon, as well as the blood found near the crime scene, both came back as a match for Burns's DNA profile. However, contrary to Burns's story, Burns's blood was not found near Ottman's body, and Ottman's blood was not found near the dumpster. Detectives also learned that most of the time, Tonya had to use a walker or was in a wheelchair, as she had a disability that made it difficult for her to walk on her own. With this condition, it was doubtful that she would have been able to attack someone on her own, especially with the intent or ability to seriously injure them. At the time in 2007, investigators wanted to charge Burns with murder, as they were highly suspicious of his claim that he acted in self-defense. However, the state attorney's office concluded that there was insufficient evidence to refute Burns's version of events when they were presented with the case. As detectives did not have any solid evidence to go against Burns's claims at the time, they had to let the case go, and eventually it turned cold. It would remain dormant for another 14 years. Then finally, in 2021, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit began reviewing the case in the hopes of finding new clues. After taking another close look at all the circumstantial and physical evidence, a detective went to Burns's home on January 14, 2022, to interview him about the events surrounding Tonya's stabbing. When he recounted the details of that dreadful night, Burns gave the detective the same information. He said he had been drinking heavily when he heard Tonya begin to scream at him without any sort of provocation from his side. At first, he'd only walked to the laundry room to close the door, but then he decided to confront her. He said that when he walked over to her trailer, Tonya punched him hard in the stomach. He said that at that moment he did not notice anything, but soon after he realized he was bleeding and began to panic. Strangely, he also said that Tonya was not armed with any sort of knife or weapon, and never took his knife from him, but somehow she managed to stab him. Due to the inconsistent evidence he was providing them, detectives were fairly sure that Burns was lying. However, as they began to plan how to build a stronger case, they got an unexpected lucky break. A little over a week after that interview, an unnamed witness contacted the sheriff's office, saying that she had information on a cold case from 2007. When she was interviewed by the police, she told them that on the day of the murder 14 years prior, Burns had approached her in the mobile home park just after the detectives left. He had then gone on to tell her that he knew he did something wrong. He also claimed that he was confessing because he wanted to face what he'd done. The witness also said that Burns told her he knew Tonya was disabled at the time of her death. Finally, she told them that Burns had given her a signed letter which had all the details of the incident, and she handed this in to the detectives. Only 2 days after this, the witness once again contacted the police. This time she told them that Burns himself had approached her again and had said that he had written the letter in an attempt to prove that he was acting in self-defense. He said that he had done this because he hoped to receive no punishment for a self-defense case rather than a first-degree murder. The witness also revealed that he told her he had no regrets for what he had done and that he had said that Tonya got what she deserved, indicating that he hated the woman. A few days later, on January 28, 2022, the witness once again contacted the detectives, stating that Burns had given her another signed letter, but the details in this were contradictory to the first one he had provided. There were differences between this new letter and his verbal descriptions of the event as well. Finally, in February 2022, the detectives were once again contacted by the witness, who told them that Burns had provided her with yet another statement. This time because she confronted him about the contradictions present between his previous letters and verbal accounts. During this confrontation, she told detectives her son had also been present, and they'd both asked Burns how he'd been stabbed that day 14 years ago. Burns, this time, gave them the whole truth. He confessed to the witness and her son that on the day of the murder, he had noticed Tonya when he was walking to the laundry room. He returned home to go get his knife, as he intended to seriously harm her when he walked over to talk to her. He said an argument broke out between them that led them to fighting over the knife, and when Tonya tried to leave to go home, he stabbed her several times and then cut her throat. After this, to set up the self-defense scenario, he stabbed himself in the stomach twice. Burns gave the witness a third written statement with all of this information, saying it contained the truth. This third letter ended with an admission from Burns that he hated Tonya and intended to deliberately hurt her that night, and ended up killing her. The details in this third statement were consistent with evidence collected at the crime scene, and investigators matched a latent fingerprint on one of the statements to Burns. This was finally enough evidence to make a case against him, and they arrested him for murder. In a statement Burns provided after his arrest, he said, "This was a terrible tragedy that I'm responsible for. I wish I could change it." Whether this remorse was real or not, on February 3, 2022, authorities took him into custody and charged him with Tonya's murder. Carol Jean Pierce was born as Carol Jean Fillion on December 4, 1939, to parents Pauline Elnora Knapp Fillion and Raymond Joseph Fillion. The family lived a simple and humble life in Wisconsin, with Carol excelling at school, especially in the school band. In 1957, she married Danny Dean August, but the marriage did not last long. In 1958, she divorced August and would go on to wed Dr. Jock D. Clark in 1960. The two bore a son together, Mark Clark, but divorced soon after in 1964. Carol was now a single mother, looking for stability for herself and her baby. On September 3, 1966, 35-year-old Carol Jean married the love of her life, Richard Pierce. Pierce was active in the U.S. Coast Guard, and as a result, the two often moved around the U.S. Finally, in 1973, the two settled down at the Sunrise Shores Trailer Park in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Richard had been assigned to work on the USCGC Mesquite long-term. Carol was excited about finally being able to put down some roots and began contemplating what the future might look like. Carol was said to be utterly devoted to her son Mark from her previous marriage. She felt her purpose in life was to take care of Mark in the home, and she happily slipped into the role of a stay-at-home mother and wife. But not all that glitters is gold. Whilst Carol and Richard lived like an idyllic couple to the outside world, trouble was brewing within the marriage. Neighbors would report hearing the screams and shouts of Carol and Richard as they were embroiled in intense arguments. Richard could often be heard belittling Carol, and soon the arguments turned physical. Carol was often seen around the trailer park with black eyes and a battered body. A concerned neighbor, who worked as an X-ray technician, saw Carol's injuries one day and offered to help her. When he asked her how she'd sustained the injuries, she fell quiet before telling him that she'd fallen. Given his medical experience, the neighbor didn't believe Carol's story, but there was nothing he could do. On one occasion, Carol told another neighbor, "Richard is going to kill me." As Carol refused to call the police or press charges, there was nothing anybody at the trailer park could do but watch as Carol slowly lost the battle. The arguments and beatings continued for years, all while Carol worked desperately to maintain a perfect image. Richard was close to retiring from the U.S. Coast Guard, and Carol had been saving away 35 cents at a time in order to buy him a ring as a surprise. The two also entered marriage counseling, which did little to quell the fighting. As part of Richard's retirement, the two had planned to find a fresh start once again and move to Sheboygan, Michigan. Yet, before Carol got the chance to experience farm life, she mysteriously vanished. According to Richard, before she left, she withdrew $20,000 from their savings account and signed over the titles to some land and a truck. Sources are conflicted, but either September 5th or 8th, 1975, would mark the last day that Carol was ever seen alive at her home on West Elm Street and Avenue Sturgeon Bay. In Richard's version of events, he left for work as usual that morning, and when he returned around 4 p.m., Carol was gone. Interestingly, on September 5th, 1975, Richard and the crew of the USCGC Mesquite were docked in Chicago. That day, Richard was given leave and returned on September 6th. 2 weeks after Carol was last seen, Richard officially retired from the U.S. Coast Guard, and his friends and family threw him an extravagant retirement party. Glasses clinked, and chatter filled the air. But one voice was missing: Carol. Carol had seemingly been excited about planning the party in the lead-up to his retirement. Carol's mother, who was in attendance, immediately noticed that her daughter was missing. When confronted, Richard told Carol's mother that she had simply taken off. Richard would maintain this version of events for decades. He even nonchalantly told his colleagues that Carol Jean had walked out on him. It wasn't until Carol's mother discovered that she was not at the party that she was officially reported missing to the Sturgeon Bay Police Department. Unfortunately, the SBPD showed little interest in Carol's case. As far as they were concerned, she was an unhappy housewife who left of her own volition to start a new life. Carol's mother knew her daughter would never leave her family behind, especially her son, Mark. Her son, Mark Clark, later told Oxygen she would have never run away or done this disappearing act or sacrificed her own family on her own. This was out of character. She was a fighter. Richard murdered her. The case didn't gain the traction it deserved until the mid-1980s, by which time her family felt it was too late. Shortly after Carol's disappearance, Richard moved the trailer the two had shared to a farm in Sheboygan, Michigan. A month later, Rose Marlene Box moved into Richard's trailer. 2 years later, in 1977, Richard divorced Carol Jean and married his new girlfriend, Rose. When investigators finally dived into Carol's disappearance, they discovered that she had left almost everything behind. Her purse, makeup, her 1970 Chevy pickup, and her beloved cat had all been left behind at the trailer. The working theory that she had voluntarily walked away was shattered, and the SBPD began considering other options. Progress was slow, and Carol's family were unhappy with the SBPD's initial response. In 2008, the SBPD teamed up with investigators in Sheboygan, Michigan, to conduct a search of Richard's property and land. Investigators believe that Richard had killed Carol and buried her somewhere in the Michigan home. Deputy Ronald Fenlon of the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Office helped lead the investigation, taking them deep into Richard's home's crawlspace. Fenlon would also later testify in court that during his 2008 search, he discovered a cut in the concrete that had been filled with rocks and dirt. When he returned 10 years later, in 2018, the cut was no longer filled in. In 2018, the Wisconsin Cold Case Review looked at Carol's case and determined there was enough to show that Richard was set to gain from Carol's disappearance. By 2018, crime scene investigation techniques had come on leaps and bounds, and the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Office brought a canine unit to Richard's home. According to court documents, the dogs, trained to pick up the smell of human remains, alerted 6 times to the presence of human remains in the home. An excavation was performed on one of these sites. However, to this day, Carol's remains have never been found. In October 2018, 82-year-old Richard Gale Pierce was arrested and charged with the murder of his ex-wife, Carol. The criminal complaint, filed by the Door County Circuit Court, stated, "Upon review of this case, the team concluded that the defendant, Richard, gained numerous things based on Carol Jean's disappearance, which included a pension unencumbered by a wife, most of the important belongings of their marriage, land and a home in Michigan, a new girlfriend weeks after Carol Jean's disappearance, as well as the benefit of Carol Jean's silence." In 2022, 86-year-old Richard Gale Pierce appeared at the Door County Court, where the defense and prosecution laid out their arguments. Richard's defense argued that they could not prove that he had killed Carol without a body. The prosecution provided evidence from the searches of Richard's home and detailed all the things he stood to gain in Carol Jean's absence. It took the jury 10 hours to deliberate, and after consideration, they found Richard Gale Pierce guilty for first-degree murder and disinterment of the dead. Richard will now spend the rest of his natural life in prison, serving a life sentence. In 1985, Karen Swift graduated from Walnut Ridge High School, Arkansas, and began to forge her own path. Those who knew Karen at school described her as witty and strong-willed. She was known to be full of life. The two moved to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and were married. Shortly after their union, the dynamic of their relationship changed significantly. One friend told the police that they'd noticed how much Karen had changed at their school reunion. She was still her lively self. That was, until David spoke up. Those around her watched as David told her precisely what to do and that he expected her to follow his instructions. This level of control gradually wore Karen down, but she tried to maintain a happy and outgoing personality for the sake of her 4 children. Even though friends had noticed a considerable change in Karen's character.
Lulu, that's enough. Thank you. Did you get them?
And those around her knew she would never abandon them. So when she disappeared from a Halloween party in 2011, her friends knew something was wrong. On the evening of October 29, 2011, Karen attended a Halloween party hosted at the Farms Country Club in Dyersburg, Tennessee, with 2 friends, Bill and Kathy Bona. Those in attendance said that Karen seemed normal, and there was no indication of what was to come. By 12 a.m., the party had wound down, and everyone was ready to head back home to get some rest. It's believed that Karen headed home for a short period of time, as at around 1 a.m., she received a call from her daughter, Ashley. Ashley explained to her mother that she was at a sleepover but didn't feel well and needed her to come and pick her up. Karen swung her car around and headed for the house that Ashley was at. After collecting her daughter, the two returned home and climbed into bed together. According to reports, after around 30 minutes, Karen carried Ashley into her other daughter's room so that she wouldn't have to sleep alone for the night. Karen put her 2 daughters to bed at around 3 a.m., and after that, she vanished into thin air. Her husband, David, is believed to have been the last person in the home to see Karen before she went missing. The next morning, the Swifts awoke and immediately noticed Karen's absence. David turned the entire house upside down, looking for his beloved wife. Neighbors confirmed that he went around the estate, knocking on doors and shouting Karen's name. Concerned residents crept out of their homes to see what the commotion was, and that was when they learned that Karen had disappeared in the night. Later that day, Karen's 2004 Nissan Murano was found abandoned about a mile away from her home. The car had a flat tire that was caused by a drywall screw. Karen's Halloween costume was still inside, but her purse was missing. These revelations made the knot in David's stomach tighter, and that afternoon, he contacted the Dyer County Sheriff's Office to report his wife missing. The Dyer County Sheriff's Office responded immediately, and the search for Karen began. Investigators began performing a forensic sweep of the home, but found little to no clues. It was almost as if Karen had vanished into thin air. David told investigators that it was common for Karen to leave home to visit friends, but investigators didn't believe she would leave early in the morning to see someone. David became a prime suspect, and the search for Karen continued. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation also joined the search for Karen, deploying officers, dogs, and helicopters to try and find her. Days into the investigation, detectives learned that in the months before her disappearance, 44-year-old Karen was in the process of filing for divorce. It's unclear whether David was aware that he was about to be served with divorce papers, but investigators saw it as a motive to want to get rid of her. The search for Karen would come to a grinding halt on December 10, 2011, when hunters found her body in some bushes in a cemetery in Dyersburg. The discovery rocked the town, and people poured into the Swift home to offer their condolences. Karen's cause of death wouldn't be revealed until many years later. The coroner determined that Karen had suffered blunt force trauma to the head and several fractures to her body. The report also noted that Karen was found to be partially clothed, indicating a possible assault. To the outside world, David Swift was a grieving husband who had been left behind with 4 children. But deep down, he was hiding a dark secret. Carol Johnson, Karen's mother, told Oxygen, "Since that time, he's never picked up the phone and called and asked about the investigation. To me, if it was my wife that had been murdered, I'd be burning the phone up every day for answers." Whilst David maintained his family man persona to the community, the Dyersburg Police Department was making waves in their investigation. The investigation would be slow, and multiple searches of David's home were performed without arrest. But finally, in 2022, David Swift was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Karen Smith. In the years since Karen's murder, David moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and remarried. He had forged a new life for himself, trying to bury the old one deep in his conscience. The arrest came after the Dyersburg Police Department handed the case over to the District Attorney General's office in 2019. The Dyersburg sheriff told NBC that all of the evidence pointed to David, so it was easy to rule out everyone else as a suspect. They also commented that they believed the jury had made the right decision in charging him with premeditated first-degree murder. David Swift is currently being held without bail by the
No. Lulu.
Tennessee to face the charges. The case against David is currently ongoing, and he's set to appear in court in 2023. If found guilty, David Swift could face a life sentence without parole. On February 14, 2017, the bodies of Abigail Williams and Liberty German were found near the same hiking trail that they had gone missing on the day before. This case takes us to Delphi, Indiana, a small town in Indiana just under 3 square miles in size, and with a population of only around 3,000 people.
No.
Abigail
Lulu.
Joyce Williams and Liberty
No
Rose
barking.
were a pair
No
of best
barking.
friends from Delphi, Indiana. Abby was born
Thank
on
you.
the 23rd of June, 2003,
They're like
while Libby was
children.
around 6 months older than her, having been born on the 27th of December, 2002. At the time of their tragic demise, Abby was 13 and Libby was 14 years old. They both attended the Delphi Community Middle School, which was where they met each other and became best friends. They bonded over shared love of the outdoors, with both of them loving activities such as camping, hiking, and swimming. They were always together, and in 2017, they were in the 8th grade, and both were very excited about starting high school the next year. The duo were always planning out the next 4 years of their lives together. They imagined a happy, bright future where they could grow up together. But sadly, this would never come to be. On February 13, 2017, the two girls had planned to take a hike on the Monon High Bridge Trail, which is part of the Delphi Historic Trails in rural Delphi, Indiana. Normally, they would have been accompanied by an adult, but as the girls were almost in high school now, they were allowed to go on their own for the hike. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. They were dropped off near the start of the trail on County Road 300 North, east of the Hoosier Heartland Highway, by Libby's older sister, Kelsey German, at 1:35 p.m. on February 13th. The girls were having a fun time to start with, and at 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a video of Abby walking over the bridge. This was the last time either of them was ever heard from. They were supposed to meet Libby's father at 3:15 p.m., but when they did not show up, he knew something was wrong, as he was sure that the girls would never intentionally miss their deadline to meet him. Their families were terrified that something horrible had befallen the two young girls, so they first searched for them on their own. But then, when they could not find a single trace of the two girls, they reported them missing to the police at 5:30 p.m. that day. Initially, authorities did not suspect foul play as the reason for the disappearance, believing it was possible that the two young girls had simply wandered off the hiking trail and gotten lost in the wilderness. However, when the bodies of the two girls were found the next day at noon, around half a mile east of the abandoned Monon High Bridge, on the north bank of the Deer Creek, everyone's worst fears were realized. Police have still not released details of how the girls were murdered. In fact, very few details were released to the public regarding how and what state the girls were found in. However, one of the details that was released is the fact that there was video recovered from one of the victims' phones that helped police identify the suspect. A still image taken from this video was released in the hopes that someone could identify the killer. A composite sketch was also released to the public. On July 17, 2017, officers distributed a composite sketch of someone who, at the time of the investigation, was sought as a person of interest in the murders. It had apparently been composed by the police from eyewitness accounts of a certain hiker who was seen on the Delphi Historic Trails on the day that the girls vanished. On April 19, 2019, the Indiana State Police announced a new direction in the case. Superintendent Doug Carter released more materials a few days later in a press conference held on April 22nd. The new materials included a short video recording in which the blue-jeaned and jacketed suspect is seen walking along the bridge for a little over a second. An updated sketch of the suspect was also unveiled, and an extended version of the audio recording, in which a slight rise in the suspect's voice can be detected as he utters the word, "Guys," before the phrase, "down the hill." The updated sketch raised some eyebrows, as it appeared to be of a much younger man than the original sketch had been. These clips, when released to the public, brought in a huge number of tips from citizens trying to help. However, investigators were unable to use them to narrow their focus onto any real suspect in the case. The police, however, did find a few suspects over the course of the investigation. One such suspect was a registered offender from Indiana who was arrested in Woodland Park, Colorado in September 2017 and charged with threatening strangers on a monument trail with a hatchet. But in early February 2018, authorities said this suspect was no longer considered an active person of interest in the Delphi murders. Another one of these suspects was Paul Etter, who was wanted for the kidnapping and assault of a 26-year-old woman on June 22nd in Tippecanoe County. Police thought it was possible he could be linked to this crime as well, considering his past. On June 27, 2019, Paul was confronted and surrounded by the police, but after a 5-hour standoff, he killed himself to avoid being arrested. 27-year-old Keegan Klein was also a suspect in the case. A man with a number of charges against him, Keegan was a prime suspect for police at the time and was arrested in 2020. In his interrogation, police learned that Klein had communicated with Libby German the day before her murder and on the day of the killing. However, in the end, police could find no evidence that Klein had actually met Libby and Abby. He's only been charged with pornography-related offenses and not the murder of the two girls. It was only in 2022, 5 years after the murder had taken place, that the police finally made an arrest in the case. The man police believe is the perpetrator is Richard Allen, a native of Delphi, who owned a number of guns and other weapons and was also on the same trail as the girls on that afternoon in 2017. In fact, Allen was interviewed by the police in 2017 as well, and even admitted to being on the same trail the afternoon of the murders. But at the time, police did not have any evidence linking him to the crime. However, in 2022, new evidence which had not been released to the public led police to circle back to Allen as a suspect for the crime. In an October 13, 2022 interview, Allen told police he saw the juvenile girls on the trails east of Freedom Bridge and said he went onto the Monon High Bridge near where the girls were killed. In November of 2022, 50-year-old Allen was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He entered a not guilty plea, but will soon face trial to determine his guilt. One of the few pieces of information that was released to the public was the fact that an unspent round was discovered near the bodies of the girls. An unspent bullet is one that has the casing and the projectile still together, and this usually happens if the bullet is faulty or the gun jams while firing. The round that was found near the girls was matched to a .40 caliber gun that Allen owned, placing him at the scene of the crime. Other than this, details about the case remain scarce. We hope the families of the girls get some form of closure from knowing that the man who allegedly took their children from them is now being made to pay the price for his actions. Anna Jean Kane was born in 1962 in Reddings, Pennsylvania. She was raised in a chaotic household. She adored her 2 sisters, Jean Marie Camacho and Deborah J. Carter Jane, with all of her heart. Despite Sylvia Fern Kane's efforts to give her children a decent life, Anna did not have one. Anna was subjected to physical abuse from her father at a young age. Low family money and physical abuse all contributed to Anna's drug addiction. It was unknown how Anna got pregnant, but she had 3 little children, 1 daughter and 2 sons. Anna started working as a sex worker since she had a family to support. She spent several years working in the Reading region. Anna was by no means a perfect citizen, given the lifestyle she led. She was arrested numerous times for performing sexual services and petty theft, but she genuinely cared about her children and wanted them to do better. Anna and her children frequently had to relocate due to her line of work. In 1988, Anna Kane relocated to Birdsboro in Pennsylvania's Berks County and soon found herself struggling to make ends meet. Tamika, the eldest daughter, was 9 years old at the time. After a happy meal on October 22, 1988, Tamika, Anna's eldest child, pleaded with her mother not to leave the house. She was unaware of any impending occurrences. She only had an awful feeling and wished her mother were still nearby. Anna made the decision to go, against the pleas of her daughter. She promised her daughter she'd return shortly after going to the supermarket, but instead she went to Reading in search of a client. That evening, when Tamika called her mother, Anna informed her that she was heading home. It was the last time Tamika would ever hear her mother's voice. On October 23, 1988, at around 1 a.m., someone saw Anna in Reading's red light area between Franklin Street and South 6th Street. This was the last time she'd be seen alive. The next morning, a Perry resident was out on his own and came across something strange on the side of the Ontolani Trail in a rural area close to Route 662. He took a closer look and saw that it was a human body. The face was badly bruised, and the person appeared to have been battered and strangled with baling twine. It was a horrifying find. The local man became alarmed and dialed 911. When police arrived on the site, they recognized Anna Jean Kane's body. Although there wasn't much evidence at the scene, Anna's clothing provided DNA samples. The investigators started looking for clues once Anna was brought to the coroner's office for examination. Asphyxiation caused by strangling was identified as the cause of death following the autopsy. According to the report, Anna had already been dead for more than 12 hours when her body was discovered. DNA technology was not as developed back then as it is now. When the DNA extracted from Anna's clothing was examined, it was found to have an indeterminate male profile and no age. Anna's family was devastated and wanted explanations, but there were no hints as to what had occurred that tragic night. When there were initially no suspects in sight, investigators were put in a difficult situation. It was difficult to identify suspects in this case because Anna was constantly exposed to danger due to her line of work. It was also unclear why this murder was committed. A closer look at the body indicated that she had not been sexually assaulted. Therefore, it was clear that it was not even sexually motivated. They speculated that Anna's face might have been injured as a consequence of a struggle between her and her attacker. Although Anna Kane's case did not get much media attention, the Reading Eagle, a local newspaper, published a front-page story seeking information about Anna Jean Kane soon after the murder. Oddly enough, just 15 months later, in February 1990, the newspaper received an anonymous letter from a concerned citizen. This letter contained a lot of details about the murder never released to the public, which led investigators to believe the killer had sent it. Detectives collected DNA from the saliva that was used to seal the letter sent to the newspaper. When it was tested, it matched the DNA found on Anna's clothes, which confirmed their suspicion of the murderer sending the letter. However, since they had no idea who the DNA belonged to, nothing came out of this, and the case went cold. DNA technology has greatly improved over time. The Pennsylvania State Police Department transferred the DNA it had extracted from the newspaper letter and Anna Kane's clothing to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia for DNA profiling after years of working on the unsolved murder of Anna Kane in 2022. A match was eventually discovered by detectives using genetic genealogy. Scott Grimm was identified as the killer of Anna Kane. Later, detectives claimed that they had obtained the murderer's distant relative's DNA. However, they did not specify how they did so. Officials stated that Scott Grimm resided in the same neighborhood in 1988, but they had not yet discovered any connections between Grimm and Anna. At a press conference, Trooper Daniel Womer of the Pennsylvania State Police clarified, "That doesn't mean there wasn't some connection we haven't uncovered yet." Detectives claimed that Scott Grimm had never been recognized before because his DNA was not stored in the criminal database in the early 1990s, because he'd never been charged with a crime. He had been arrested in the past for harassing a former business partner in 2002, but his DNA was never collected. Scott Grimm sadly passed away in 2018 at the age of 58 from natural causes, and so he could never be brought to justice. After waiting for decades, Anna Kane's family could finally get some closure, though they were understandably disappointed that the killer would not face any form of justice. Tamika, now 43, said, "I didn't think I'd see this day, but I had hope. My emotions are all over the place. Happy, sad, and angry." Shannon Lloyd, then 23 years old, was a renter in a Garden Grove house in California in 1987. She was full of adventure even at a young age, having visited numerous U.S. cities. It was common knowledge that she was a self-proclaimed tomboy who had a soft spot for equines. On May 21, 1987, she was found dead in her bathroom. The autopsy revealed that she was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The California Police Department failed to find any solid leads into her case. The investigation continued, but the police were constantly failing. They interviewed almost every person who was related to Shannon Lloyd, but didn't receive anything tangible to follow. The case was slowly growing cold. But suddenly, the California Police Department were alert again when they were informed of another case which was similar to Shannon's. In 1989, they received reports of the murder of Renee Cubas. Renee Cubas, a 27-year-old mother of two, was a neighbor of Shannon's. For Renee, her children were everything. Renee wasn't rich, but she took care of her children in the best possible way she could. Sadly, she wasn't aware what her fate was, and how her life would soon end before its time. On the morning of February 19, 1989, her body was found on Lambert Road in Irvine, California, near El Toro Marine Base. The murder investigation was kept under wraps by the police. They were not able to find any suspect or even evidence. Their constant hard work wasn't producing the results they wanted. But the style of killing and how the victims were found indicated that the murderer was likely the same for both the victims. For a long period of time, the killings of Shannon and Renee were not being investigated further as the police ran out of leads to chase. The cases went cold. The next step occurred in 2003 when the criminal's DNA was placed into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Despite this, they were still unable to identify Renee's murderer, and the investigation was ultimately closed without any arrests being made. It took investigative genetic genealogy technology for the detectives working for the Orange County DA to identify a suspect in the killings of Renee and Shannon in 2021. He was Reuben Smith. Although he was born in Michigan, Reuben J. Smith spent the 1980s in Orange County, California. He was jailed in 1998 for sexually assaulting and attempting to kill a lady in Las Vegas. After his arrest, he had to give a DNA sample to officials who entered him into a database. By comparing the samples, detectives in the year 2022 were able to positively identify Reuben as the culprit of the crimes against Renee and Shannon. Unfortunately, Smith shot himself in the head in July 1999 at the age of 39, long before he would have faced justice for the assault on the third unnamed lady. Police are looking into the possibility that he had committed more crimes. The Baca County Sheriff's Office answered a call from a Colorado farm on June 3, 1988. About 20 miles southeast of the town of Springfield in Baca County, Colorado, a local farmer notified the local sheriff's office that he discovered what he thought to be human remains on his farm. The remains were identified as human, where they were observed by the then sheriff Willard Goff and then coroner Robert Morrow and other deputies. The remains consisted of what was most of the human skeleton, but the bones were not all there, and what was there was white and bleached. The investigators then searched the area for leads, while the remains were taken to the coroner's office for an autopsy. Sadly, they were unable to uncover any evidence that would have allowed them to identify the victim. With the help of the farm owner, personnel from the Baca County Sheriff's Office and coroner's office spent several days searching the land. They recorded a number of things discovered there and tested the local soil for possible proof. Nothing, however, was discovered to help identify the bones, ascertain how or why the individual had died, or explain how they'd ended up in the farmer's field. Following a forensic examination, it was determined that the victim was a female between the ages of 19 and 24. She weighed about 130 pounds and was between 5'2" and 5'4" tall. Her hair was brown, but the decayed remains made it impossible to tell what color her eyes were. She was dressed in a beige winter coat with a white synthetic fur collar and 4-inch fur cuffs, gray corduroy Levi jeans with the leg cuffs hemmed up to a 27.5-inch inseam, and a 34B bra. Although the victim displayed characteristics of Hispanic or Latino, Native American, and European people, forensics were unable to identify her ancestry. She had substantial dental treatment, including 2 silver cast crowns on her left side, which suggested that she might be Mexican or have grown up close to the border. Her body's internals gave away the possibility that she'd never given birth. Additionally, it was determined that she'd passed away between 1 and 3 years before the discovery of her remains, and the cause of her death was determined to be suspicious, most likely a homicide. Authorities at the time were unable to locate any of the victim's family members to return her remains to, since she remained unidentified. They referred to the victim as the Baca County Jane Doe due to the lack of a name. The original documents of Jane Doe's death were all retained at the sheriff's and coroner's offices, and she was buried in the Springfield Cemetery. Numerous efforts were made throughout the years to identify her. In an effort to find a match within the missing persons database, dental impressions and records of the victim were submitted to the National Crime Identification Center. Despite the fact that DNA was still in its infancy at the time when it comes to victim identification, DNA samples were also collected and submitted for processing. The body's remains were subjected to an anthropological investigation to learn more about any potential clues on the body that would help identify it. To gain a better picture of what the person may have looked like, investigators also created a facial reconstruction. To pinpoint the deceased's prior location before her passing, even the fillings in her teeth were examined. Numerous prospective matches, including probable dental matches, were obtained, but as the investigation went on, each one was eliminated after being compared to the remains. The public was invited to come forward with any information they might have about the victim during press conferences that investigators scheduled, but no one did. Thus, no conclusions could be made from those. The body remained unidentified, and the case went cold in spite of the best efforts of the detectives. Finally, 3 decades later, in 2021, the case was reopened when the Baca County Sheriff's and Coroner's offices were contacted by an investigative intern working for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. This intern wanted to submit the data from the case into NamUs, a national database of missing and unidentified persons. It did not bring an immediate result, but the case got renewed attention, which also brought up other resources. Old case files were gone through, and a genetic genealogy lab was contacted in the hopes of getting Jane Doe identified. However, they soon learned that the DNA reports they collected in the initial investigation were not enough to conduct a familial DNA study, so Jane Doe's body had to be exhumed to get fresh samples. The Baca County Sheriff's Office was informed by NamUs about the identification of a different familial DNA match for Jane Doe about a year later, on September 26, 2022. The Texas resident who provided her DNA to the McAllen Police Department in Texas in 2004 had done so in an effort of finding her missing mother, Nora Elia Castillo. Josie Castillo, Nora's daughter, submitted Nora Castillo's missing person report in 1996, despite the fact that she'd been missing since 1986 or 1987. The McAllen Police Department's report states that Nora Castillo's final communication with someone was a collect call made from someplace in Colorado just before she vanished. Nora Castillo's identity as the Jane Doe from Baca County was then established through additional DNA testing and analysis. As a child, Josie Castillo could not spend much time with her mother because her father had custody. Despite that, she recalled her as a vivacious individual who cherished laughter and a smile. Josie also recalled how social services became involved when Nora was having problems when she was 6 years old and her sister Crystal was 3. While they were living with their father in New Mexico, Nora made an effort to kidnap them, but she ended up in the Hobbs, New Mexico jail after getting into some problems. She allegedly went to a mental hospital after that, and that was the last time anyone ever saw her. After their mother mysteriously vanished, the girls spent years wondering where Nora was and how to find her. Finally, they had an answer. Along with Josie, her sister Crystal was also notified of their mother's spinal fate. Although their hope of ever getting their mother alive was shattered, they were happy to have a sense of closure after all those years of waiting. All this came out of absolutely nowhere, and it's a lot, Crystal stated. Despite seeking answers regarding what led to her mother's untimely demise, Josie said she can now go to sleep at night knowing where her mom is, thanks to genetic genealogy. My heart is healing. There is a healing process now, Josie stated. The details of how Nora Elia Castillo died and why she was in Colorado are still under investigation. For now, this case is still being investigated as a potential homicide.
Okay,
The police
go
have
around.
asked anyone having information regarding the case to come forward. Heather Ann Wilms was born in Texas in 1984 to Gordon Wilms and Donna Ellis. She was having a good time after studying at O'Connor High School in 2001 and was going to San Antonio College and Texas Lutheran University for further studies.
Okay, that's good.
Amanda, Olivia, Michaela, Jackson, and Jason were
The
her 5
ravioli's
siblings.
going.
Many of her siblings admired her, notably Jose Baldomero Flores, whom she and her family referred to as Joe. Heather and Jose met at O'Connor and had remained friends ever since. She frequently invited him to her family's home for dinner. Heather was scheduled to begin her shift as a waitress at Champs Americana restaurant on February 21, 2005, but she never showed up. Her friends and family attempted to contact her, but received no response. Heather's body was discovered inside her home the next morning. Her father and his friends discovered her in the bedroom of her Leon Valley apartment after she'd failed to show up for work the day before. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her murder left everyone stunned. The family contacted the Leon Valley Police Department to report the horrific discovery. The police reached her home and began their investigation. Their first objective was to get as much information as possible. The police interviewed her friends and family. However, no arrests were made, and the police did not even identify a single suspect. Eventually, the case turned cold. 6 years later, the city witnessed another gruesome crime. On March 2, 2011, the city fireman team responded to an apartment fire in San Antonio, Texas. When they arrived and started putting out the fire, they discovered the body of a woman inside the flat. The San Antonio Police Department was contacted by the firefighting teams. Neighbors recognized the lady as 30-year-old Esmeralda Herrera after the police inquiry. She'd been cuffed, sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The police discovered that the fire was deliberately lit to destroy the evidence. However, the attempt failed because not all the evidence was destroyed. A forensic expert discovered unidentified DNA on a beer can in the kitchen, as well as hairs and fibers and a bloody shoe print. Later, police discovered that Esmeralda had been conversing with one person on and off throughout the day, a friend called Jose Baldomero Flores, the same individual that had been Heather Wilms's close friend. Esmeralda's acquaintance told authorities that she'd known Jose for nearly a year. Esmeralda had told a friend the day before her death that Jose would be visiting her the next day. The police now had a suspect in the murder of Esmeralda. Based on the new findings, Jose was charged 6 weeks later. However, he was released only a month after that, after the district attorney's office stated that more specific evidence was required to indict him. The police were constantly working on the case and trying to find the required evidence. It would be another 5 years before an arrest was made, this time with the assistance of the Texas Rangers. Though police did not release the evidence they found against him, Jose was arrested and charged not just with Esmeralda's murder, but also with Heather Wilms's. Two families were linked together by the crimes committed by someone both of their daughters knew and considered a friend. This was the most devastating aspect for the family because the horrible killings were not carried out by a stranger. They'd have to wait again, this time for justice, which would arrive in 2022. Jose accepted a plea deal just days before a jury was to be selected for one of his impending trials. Flores received 2 consecutive life sentences for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The family's initial demand was for a death sentence. The Herrera family had a letter read in court by a victim advocate in which they expressed their desire for Flores to suffer in jail. Flores is now serving his life terms at the Garza West unit in Beeville. Several news reporters attempted to speak to him, but he did not respond. On February 26, 1999, a body was found in a forest near a church cemetery in DeKalb County, Georgia. Locals were the first to discover the body and alerted the DeKalb Police Department. The remains were badly decomposed. After the initial investigation, the police were not able to find to whom the body belonged. The autopsy found that the body belonged to an African-American boy between the ages of 5 and 7. He'd also been dead for 3 to 6 months, according to their findings. He was dressed in a plaid blue and white shirt, red denim jeans, and brown Timberland boots. The brand-name boots were a detail that became public throughout the years-long search for him. The investigators interviewed some locals, but no one was able to identify the body. Police didn't lose hope as they continued their investigation. Despite the immense efforts of the investigators, they found nothing. The case went cold for over 2 decades. Finally, after 23 years, a phone call changed the case completely, and the authorities were able to identify the name of the body, which was released to the media in July 2022. The body was that of William Deshawn Hamilton. The persistence of 2 ladies who, for various reasons, never forgot the child, helped to solve the mystery of William's identity.
Wow.
One was Ava, a friend of William's mother, Teresa Ann Bailey Black, who had formed an unbreakable bond with the youngster. The other was reporter Angeline Hartman, who covered the issue regularly over the years in the hope that someone would come forward and identify him. That happened in May 2020, when Ava, a Charlotte, North Carolina resident, called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, where Hartman worked, and said she thought the remains discovered in Georgia were that of William. Her tip assisted investigators in solving the crime. Ava told A&E True Crime that she spent a lot of time with William when he and his mother resided 3 streets away from her in Charlotte. She babysat him daily before and after school for about 4 years, and the two got quite close. She remembered him as a youngster who was cheerful, brilliant, and intelligent above his years. A boy who loved to read encyclopedias and was proud of his knowledge of big words. Although his mother was a friend, she was aloof and impatient with William. Ava remarked that she was not a caring or affectionate mother. According to investigators, Black withdrew William from school in Charlotte sometime in December 1998. Black informed Ava that she and her son were relocating to Atlanta, Georgia, to be closer to family. Ava recalls saying goodbye to William clearly. She claimed that Black returned to Charlotte later that year, but without William. In answer to Ava's increasingly anxious questioning, Black explained her son's absence in a variety of ways. Ava began looking for William after not receiving any responses. She copied Georgia phone numbers she found in phone books at the local public library. She contacted hospitals, police, homeless shelters, social assistance organizations, and transportation terminals. She did it every day, sometimes for hours, occasionally falling asleep surrounded by documents, she said. Ava eventually lost track of Black. Ava was married for 20 years and had 2 daughters. Nevertheless, she never gave up searching for William. She continued to search websites and make phone calls, and her girls grew up as if they too knew the tiny boy their mother had adored. Then one day in May 2020, Ava discovered a facial reconstruction rendering done by NCMEC of the young boy discovered in Georgia in 1999. Meanwhile, Angeline Hartman, the first reporter on the scene when William's bones were discovered, had never stopped doing everything she could to keep the matter in the public eye. Hartman worked as a crime reporter for Atlanta's WAGA TV for 6 years, during which time she extensively covered the case. She departed in 2005 to work on America's Most Wanted, where she also covered the case. She eventually became the communications director of National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, commonly known as NCMEC, where she continued to ensure that William was not forgotten. Over time, experts generated various facial reconstruction representations of William. Hartman recalls how moving it was to see the first one unveiled in 1999. According to Hartman, the depiction was placed on a mannequin dressed in garments identical to those found with William's bones, including child-sized boots that she could readily envisage cradling tiny feet. NCMEC was also involved in the search for William, publicizing the case on its website and following up on leads. On the 20th anniversary of the boy's discovery, an NCMEC forensic artist prepared a new facial reconstruction representation in February 2019. Simultaneously, Hartman revisited the case in a new 6-episode series on her own podcast, Inside Crime with Angeline Hartman. The following year, in 2020, during one of her countless searches, Ava came across Hartman's podcast, which led her to the 2019 NCMEC rendering, where she identified William.
When I seen that picture, I just screamed, "Ah!" And tears just started. Because I knew that was him. It was no doubt. That was him.
With the help of Ava and Hartman, the authorities were not only able to identify William, but his murderer too. It turns out his murderer was his own mother, Teresa Ann Bailey Black. In DeKalb County Superior Court in June 2022, Black was charged with 2 charges of felony murder, 2 counts of cruelty to minors, 1 act of aggravated assault, and 1 crime of concealing the death of another. According to Black's indictment, she gave William a substance or substances, including diphenhydramine and acetaminophen, struck him in the head, causing serious bodily damage, and neglected to seek medical assistance for him. She was apprehended in Arizona and extradited to Georgia. At her arraignment, she entered a preliminary plea of not guilty. As of December 2022, she was being held at Georgia's DeKalb County Jail, waiting for her case to be placed on the court's pretrial calendar, according to DeKalb County Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney Shannon Hodder. According to her, the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office became engaged in the case when Ava contacted NCMEC, with investigators flying to North Carolina and Arizona as part of their investigation. According to officials, DNA recovered from Black in early 2022 led to the boy's identity. Potter was astounded by Ava's determination to never give up on locating William. Both commended NCMEC with evaluating tips and creating the groundwork for the case's resolution. Since meeting in July 2022, Ava and Hartman have become friends and plan to attend Black's murder trial. Ava said she was experiencing contradictory emotions after 23 years of seeking for William. She hopes to obtain permission to have William's ashes cremated and kept in her house. Ava has similar sentiments regarding Hartman's commitment to covering William's case. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office is still looking for anyone who may have known William Deshaun Hamilton or his mother, Teresa Ann Bailey Black.